Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 197, Religious Heresy. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And we are still on our hiatus from our series on Jewish learning and education to explore some recently published books that might make really interesting reading for the upcoming winter break or for Hanukkah presents. And this week we're talking to a returning guest, Jay Michaelson, the author of a recently published book entitled Enlightenment by Trial and Error, 10 Years on the Slippery Slopes of Jewish Mysticism, Postmodern Buddhist Meditation, and Heretical Flexodox Spirituality. It's a long title that actually describes somewhat how the book is still connected to our exploration of Jewish learning, because it tells the story of somebody who was in a process of self-education in a particular area that we might call spirituality or mindfulness, and tells the story of his early explorations in these areas. Subsequently, Jay's become one of the leading experts in this area of Jewish meditation, spirituality, and the intersection with Buddhism. Some of his other books include Evolving Dharma, Meditation, Buddhism, and the Next Generation of Enlightenment, Everything is God, The Radical Path of Non-Dual Judaism, and God in Your Body, Kabbalah, Mindfulness, and Embodied Spiritual Practice. This recent book is a really fascinating journey into the mind of somebody experiencing something new for the first time and trying to struggle with what it all means. In the Jewish community, Jay Michaelson is particularly well known for a column he wrote for many years in the Forward newspaper. Today, he works as a columnist for the Daily Beast and a frequent commentator on MSNBC and NPR. And he is also a teacher and editor at 10% Happier, a leading meditation platform. Jay Michaelson holds a PhD in religion from Hebrew University, a JD from Yale Law School, and also has non-denominational rabbinic ordination. We're excited to dive into another conversation with Jay Michaelson to learn about this most recent book and to pursue some of the threads we started way back when we had him on the podcast in the first year. Jay Michaelson, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
So I want to talk about the book that you just published a few days ago. Reading it in a way is like going back in a time machine. It's a period of your life that started, I think, about 15 years ago and ended about 5 or so years ago. And I'm curious why you set out to collect these particular essays and put together this book about a time in your life that is relatively long since passed.
There's two answers to that. The first is I always felt, I published a few other books, often on Jewish spirituality, since I started writing those essays. I always felt my best writing on the topic were in these essays I wrote for the journal Zeke, which I edited and co-founded. I really wrote in the first decade of the 21st century. Zeke started in 2002. Most of these essays are from around that time through around 2010. It's not that the later stuff isn't as good, but I felt that there was a certain kind of freshness and depth in those early essays that I just felt, and that, they're kind of hard to get. They're online, but you have to really search for them. And it always felt strange that what I felt were my best statements on this subject, sort of Jewish spirituality and awakening, were the hardest to find. The second reason that I put this book together, and what I did with the book was reorder them into some rational conceptual order. So they're not in chronological order. And I did do some revising to kind of take out duplications and make it cohere as a whole. I've read a lot of books in this genre, particularly spirituality in general, and they're generally written by people who have answers, and then are here to tell you the answers. It's funny, the most famous recent book on the spiritual search is probably Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert, which has its flaws, certainly, I think. But one of the things that is redeeming about that book is that the character is kind of finding things out as she goes along. That's the book that would have helped me. Not someone who's got a bunch of answers and here they are, but sort of the record of somebody doing this self-education on their own and stumbling toward some kind of answer as to what they think their Jewish practice or even their spiritual practice is about and is for.
I'm particularly interested in this question of whether, when you look back on these essays, you think of yourself at that time as actually a better 101 level teacher than you are now. You know, is there something that happens to somebody after a long period of immersion in something where they actually find it, where it's actually, where they're less good at helping new people into this process? And I'm thinking about it because so much of Jewish education is handled by people who either had their own journey into Judaism a very long time ago or never really had it because they were born into it. And we know that a lot of Jewish education is not particularly resonant for people. And I'm wondering if maybe that's part of the reason why.
I think that's a great point. I think it's true, particularly on the spirituality side. You know, the journey that's in the book, it's not one of discovering the Jewish holidays or Jewish text. I actually did have the opportunity to take classes in graduate school from some amazing Jewish philosophy scholars. And that was a real opportunity. These are people who, you know, were so experienced in their subject matter. But I think spirituality is a little bit different because of the subjective element. There's definitely an enthusiasm in some of these early essays that are now in the book that I don't experience anymore. And there's a freshness that I think is in there that I really value. And it's not like I would want to trade places. I'm certainly, as you know, people who know me and then read the book can attest, I'm much happier now than I was 18 years ago. And there's a lot of sadness, I think, particularly loneliness, particularly in the first part of the book. The book has 3 parts. You know, I think, but there's also this joy of discovery, and there's something very appealing that's in there, and that's not my true experience now. I've been along the path a lot. I've gone on long meditation retreats on the sort of Dharma and the Buddhist side, gotten a PhD in smicha and rabbinic ordination on the Jewish side since the essays in the book were completed. So it is definitely a window into a more enthusiastic and innocent part of my life. And I think that's right. I think you really kind of hit it. You know, there's a paradox for me too about writing this book, kind of, because I am embracing the word spirituality for all of its negative connotations. There's a very high percentage of people who are Jewish seekers who are looking for something like spirituality, however we define that. It could just be, it could be community in a synagogue context. It could be a community in a social justice context. It could be meditation or prayer or something like that. And yet there is this gap that certainly our educational institutions most of them don't really center that and center the tools that our tradition and others have developed around that. And I think that gap leads to a real dissonance where you can, you know, really develop your Jewish intellectual self to an extremely high level. There's fantastic institutions now where you can do that work, but spirituality doesn't have that intellectual seriousness around it because there aren't those institutions. And I think that's a tension that plays out in the book also that might be resonant for people who are on that part of the search. You know, I want things on a certain intellectual level. And then when I went into the spiritual world, things weren't always on that level. And there was really that tension. And I was really interested in the period that's captured in this book to bringing the same level of intellectual rigor to my spiritual practice as I brought to the rest of my life.
Our listeners can tell you, Dan can tell you, maybe random strangers on the street can tell you that when we have folks on this podcast, I like to ask about the names of the things they do. So the titles of their organizations, of their books. I'm just really interested in what we can discern from the titles people choose. In your case, the title of your book is fine, Enlightenment by Trial and Error. I have no problem with it, but I was really interested to talk about the subtitle. So the subtitle is 10 Years on the Slippery Slopes of Jewish Spirituality, Postmodern Buddhism, big breath, and Other Mystical Heresies. So it's a lot. It's a lot to read. And so I've got a couple interweaving questions about those various ands. First off, I want to name that it's a lot. And I think that stylistically, you do ask a decent amount of your readers. As much as this book is like a set of short pieces that then connect to each other in various ways, like, you do set a high bar. I don't think anybody would accuse you of dumbing things down. And I'm curious to ask what that can achieve and why you go that angle. Why, something like postmodern Buddhism, mystical heresies, some big phrases are right there in the subtitle, and which some people could see and be a little intimidated by. But then I do want to ask specifically about that last and. So there was Jewish spirituality, then postmodern Buddhism. The last one is, other mystical heresies. I'm really into heresy, both like practicing heresies. I identify myself as sort of a heretical Jew in a variety of ways. I've played around with tracing my own lineage to like Korach, and then Korach, the character in the Bible who like starts a whole rebellion, and then some other heretics in the Talmud and heretics later. Like, I'm really into that. But I'm curious what you mean by mystical heresies here, and why counter to what I think most of us screw up learning, which is that heresy is something you generally strive not to do. Like, why you're advocating on one level to embrace the spirit of heresy.
Great. Well, if my subtitle asks a lot, that two-part question asks even more. So let me just go to that. Yeah, I mean, so the subtitle is a combination of commercial ambition and commercial suicide. The ambition part is that Amazon ranks search results based on what's in the title and the subtitle. So lately, not just my book, but a lot of books have very long subtitles because if somebody's searching for Jewish spirituality, I want this to pop. And so that's sort of the simple reason. But right, exactly as you said, it gives with one hand and takes with the other. Right? These are words which may be intimidating or off-putting. And my main day job these days, my main career, is teaching mindfulness in a secular context on the 10% Happier app and platform, and teaching to a really broad audience. The newsletter that I edit goes out to 500,000 people every week, and it's really inspiring actually to try to really meet people where they are. And then I get to write these books, which might not be for that wide of an audience. I think it goes back to what Dan and I were talking about a minute ago, that there was a yearning on my side for intellectual rigor and maybe intellectual credibility in the spiritual search. And for me, yeah, I mean that, there's a lot in the book about hybridity, Jewish hybridity. I've talked about it with you guys on the podcast before, mixing and matching in a responsible way with some real discernment, but from different traditions and different sources. And that's how people live today, not just in a Jewish context, but more broadly. The idea that Judaism is a restaurant where you order off a set menu, I think is a 20th century idea. We're living in a food court. People at the same table may be eating different things. We're mixing and matching from different places. And that's probably reflected in the title. As far as heresies go, probably my next book will be my first academic book, which is a revision of my PhD dissertation on Jacob Frank, the great Jewish heretic, even more so than Shabtai Tzvi, who was the sort of greatest false messiah in recent Jewish history in the 17th century. One of his successors was this guy named Jacob Frank, active in 18th century Europe. And I was so attracted to and seduced by his heresy that I abandoned my doctoral studies in Hasidism to instead write about his heresy, which genealogically, the word heresy, comes from the word for belief. A heretic is someone who believes. In a way, everybody's a heretic now because let's take the simple example, keeping kosher. If you don't just do you think that keeping kosher is stupid or irrelevant or has nothing to do with you, you're not a heretic by not keeping kosher. You're just a normal person who doesn't do that particular observance. But if you deliberately don't keep kosher because you think that's actually the way that you should live your religious or spiritual life, well, now you're a heretic, right? Because now you're a believer. You actually think it's better religiously, spiritually, ethically, whatever, to not keep kosher, to break the sort of normative rules. And I've always been attracted to that. I think for me, just the idea that questioning the Jewish God or having a spirituality without God, or, when I started writing this book, I was still halachically observant. I was still keeping kind of traditional Jewish law. And in part 2 of the book, which is subtitled Unraveling, that really unravels.
So one thing jumped out about me, even when I just looked at the table of contents of your book, selfishly because I work for a project called Judaism Unbound, which was that each of the 3 sections start with un. They're unsection. There's uncoiling to describe the first portion of the book and the first segment of your experience. Then there's unraveling and there's unknowing. And so generally, I'm curious if you can start to talk a little bit about what that journey was for you and what each of those, I guess, gerunds conveyed about the portions of your life that were featured in the essays of those sections. But I'm also
You just cannot ask a one-part question.
I cannot. I am incapable of it. But I'm also curious on the unfront, because I haven't thought about this much myself, even though I work for an organization with "un" in the title, what is the power in framing something as an "un"? It's another, to me at least, counterintuitive move, sort of like buying into the spirit of heresy. What is it that the process of undoing, of being in place X and then sort of leaving that place, which to me is implied by uncoiling or unraveling or unknowing, it is taking something that was and maybe discarding it and becoming something new in one form or another. Why did you choose to structure your book that way? And what does it reflect about us? What can it mean for us if we sort of engage the world with the spirit of maybe unknowing as opposed to knowing?
For me, I think, I mean, how I, as an outsider, see the power of Judaism Unbound as a brand is that Judaism is usually bound up in a lot of other things. So for, I guess, still a majority, maybe, of American Jews, it might be bound up in a synagogue or in a movement in the way that this is done. For a large portion of folks, it's bound up to nationalism, to Israel. It's always bound up with some thing and in some container. And I think that's necessary to an extent to, for a collective enterprise, which Judaism usually is, to function. I mean, it can't just be this unbound, amorphous thing floating around. But just like, a tree needs both deep roots, but also wide branches, when things get too tightly bound, they die. It gets constricted. There's not enough breath and life in there. That's the power of un. It's the delaminating, if you will. This is kind of a metaphor that Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, the founder of Jewish Renewal, one of my core teachers, said, that Judaism, like any other ideology or religion, becomes laminated in certain things. It gets laminated in culture, in people, in tribe. Yet those laminations become difficult to sustain. If Judaism is laminated in a hyper-nationalism, or it's laminated in a theology that people just can't believe, or it's laminated in an outdated set of ethics about us and them and who counts and who doesn't, then what's inside can be destroyed. The uns of my section headings are a little bit different, but similar. So the uncoiling is really, I think the book starts with me just coming out of the closet and realizing that there are other closets I'm living in. I'm living in spiritual closets. I'm living in communal closets, places of constriction and of tightness where I felt as though I couldn't be open. But I think that maybe comes through. There's that joy of opening, of uncoiling. But with that, and just as with Judaism Unbound, there is an unraveling of certain commitments, ideas about what Jewish authenticity looked like, or what Jewish tradition or community is supposed to look like, and politics is supposed to look like. So there's kind of the shadow side, I guess, of the uncoiling. And if there's a resolution, I really didn't want there to be a resolution at the end of the book. That's what was so nice about unknowing, a phrase I lifted from the Cloud of Unknowing, a mystical text from the medieval period in Christianity, that ultimately to have some conception of the absolute is more about unknowing than knowing. I didn't want the book to end with, here's what I found, here's the answers. Even if it was qualified by, here are the answers for me and see what your own are. I wanted to end not with answers, but with what Paul Ricoeur calls second naivete. At first, there might just be ignorance, and then there's a process of gaining self-knowledge and knowledge of things, of the world. And at the end, you arrive in what Ricoeur calls this second naivete of innocence again, of I'm not really sure about anything. That felt to me like a really authentic place to end a book, because it's not the end of the spiritual path.
This part of the conversation is giving me a little bit of, I don't know, about flashbacks or something, because we're working on our own book too at the same time, which is putting out some of the earlier interviews on Judaism Unbound and trying to sort of make sense of them, but there's this process where we don't want to make too many changes. We're going to reorder things a little bit like you did, but it's really about some of the ideas that were coming out early in the process. And so there's this experience where it's interesting to go back and listen to that. And at the same time, we're also thinking about, if and when we write the book, that's actually what are our ideas now. It's a very different process.
That's definitely true for me. I almost felt, I feel comfortable saying this on the podcast, but not the introduction to the book. I don't believe a lot of the stuff that is even in the later parts of the book. So I definitely resonate with that. And a lot of the stuff actually that ended up on the cutting room floor, as you would remember, Zeke, the journal that most of these essays were originally published in, was part of this kind of flourishing of new Jewish culture that happened in the first 10 years of the century. And a lot of the kind of self-reflection on that culture didn't really age that well. I think we had a certain moment Just the way that millennials and now Gen Z see things is so different from how we did at the sort of late Gen X stage of our development. It was sort of this freshness there that was exciting because it was the first time like, oh, wow, there could be a Jewish reggae superstar. 15 years on, like that's kind of kitsch at this point. A lot of the kind of cultural sensibility that we had 15, 20 years ago, there were a bunch of those essays that touched on spirituality but had a lot of that sensibility, and I didn't include them.
Well, I want to come back around later to the spirituality stuff, but since we're on this topic, let's pursue it further, because it actually connects to our name and the name of these sections, all these unnames. When you name something starting with un, you're, in a way, saying something about at least the perception of that the thing that you're undoing is, at least in people's minds, the authentic thing to do. And you're trying to make a point that we're not that. And anytime you're kind of making a point that you're not something, I think that you haven't quite arrived at what you are yet, almost by definition. But I'm also curious to connect that to your thoughts to what you just talked about that period in the Jewish innovation world 15 years ago or whatever, because it's also something that I feel like I've made progress on in my thinking, having done the podcast, that when we launched it 4 years ago or so, I think I imagined that period that started 15 years ago or so as the dawn of some kind of age, the dawn of some new age of Jewish innovation, that we were trying to sort of collect together some of the big ideas that emerged from it, and by collecting them and putting some theory there, it would really allow people to move forward even more powerfully with it. My reflection now is actually that what was going on at that time was actually not adventurous enough. It was too close to the old Jewish institutions, the old Jewish ways of thinking. And that was, I think, the best that could possibly have been done at that time. But having now opened up the door, what's called today the Jewish innovation world needs as radical a move as the Jewish innovation world was understood to be vis-a-vis the Jewish established world 15 years ago. You know, I'm just reflecting on that in terms of both this question about the uns, but also just to get your thoughts on that world of Jewish innovation that we both were in for that decade and a half period.
Okay, so first of all, time to junk the Judaism Unbound brand so you can rename your podcast Multi-Part Questions.
Yes.
That is the defining feature of this conversation, and it's a good title for a podcast. No, it's funny, the metaphor or the image rather that's come to mind as I was listening to that question about bound and boundedness was of like the captain of the Titanic being bound to the ship as it sinks. I think Unbound still makes a lot of sense, primarily because the ship is sinking. So what's happening in the real world, right? So if we take out the little Jewish innovation sector, the mainstream Jewish community is still in a certain kind of crisis, right? It's not clear what the financial model of the current institutional Jewish community is, if that's a sustainable model or not. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I'm not really sure. But certainly the way that synagogues and large edifices have funded themselves over the past 150 years, which really isn't that long of a period of time if you think about it, that model is not working on a financial level, and it's certainly not working on a spiritual level. The number of non-Orthodox Jews who are leaving because we don't offer compelling answers is astonishing, and that continues, right? Even despite all the Jewish innovation and all the good stuff. I had a piece in the Forward a few years ago that progressive Judaism had reached its Yavne moment, and what I meant by that was when the Talmudic sages realized that Jerusalem was going to fall, the Titanic of Judaism at that time. They basically left, right? Snuck out of Jerusalem and set up their own kind of satellite. Not really sure when the old model was going to collapse, but pretty sure that it was going to happen. And I feel that's true, actually, for progressive and innovative Judaism today. Only the Yavne is kind of, and maybe it was in the Talmudic time as well, a kind of an exciting place to be. Like, I'm not negative on Jewish innovation and alternative Jewish spaces at all. And some of them take place within old edifices. So I live in Brooklyn, a few blocks from Congregation Beth Elohim, which is literally a gigantic edifice. It's this huge sort of neoclassical reform temple. And they found a way to fill it with people doing really, really good literary programs, really good social justice programs. So, the Yavne metaphor, I think, maybe the weakness of that metaphor is it doesn't even necessarily have to be in a different place. Maybe this is a counterpoint, Dan, to what you just said. I think there's been a kind of nice viral infection of some mainstream spaces. And CBE down the street from me is, I think, a really good example of that. Whether it's within existing institutions or new ones, or also small fringy ones, I actually think the innovation sector is doing pretty well. It's just, we are still surrounded by the Titanic that's sinking. And I think you're right. I think the Unbound thing for me works. And I think you're right that 15 years ago, we were still operating within a sort of mainstream mindset of how do we channel and sublimate the Jewish mainstream to do this cool stuff. Whereas now I have reached a point of cynicism, certainly around politics in the Jewish mainstream, and the way that a very right-wing iteration of Israel politics has just sort of totally pervaded the Jewish mainstream, even parts of the Jewish mainstream that say that they're pluralistic. And that's really a poison pill, especially for a lot of younger non-Orthodox Jews who are to the left of me, certainly on Israel-Palestine. So whether it's the politics or the sort of scandals involving donors, and we kind of look under the covers of the Jewish institutional mainstream, it's not a pretty picture. So if you're unbound from being tied to a sinking ship.
I think that the sinking ship, there's this conception that, like, look, the ship is what Judaism is. And that's what people conceive of. And we can't veer so much from what that ship is, because then it's just not the same thing anymore. So, like, we're going to fight for that, and then it sinks, because you can't necessarily salvage something with that mindset. But I think that what scares people is that they conflate the death of individual sinking ships with the death of Judaism as a whole beast. And so all that's to say that I think there's this sort of authenticity discourse where those congregations, those ways of practicing are the Judaism, and it's either going to die or not die. And to stray too much from it isn't really the option. Like, you can do it, but it's no longer Judaism. And like, I think the purpose of our podcast on one level is to push against that, is to say, no, like, Judaism isn't this one static thing that is authentic that we must preserve or not. The changing is what it does constantly. And I wanted to ask you about that, because you talk about authenticity multiple moments in your book. And I'm curious, like, how should we alter our relationship with concepts of, like, real Judaism, authentic Judaism, as we think about whether it's the organizational, institutional context that you've been describing, or sort of future directions of Judaism generally?
I think authenticity is such a slippery category, because we want to grab onto it and kind of say, oh, this is authentic, this is real. And often authenticity is manufactured. A lot of what people see as Kabbalah is less than 50 years old. When my grandmother had sort of advanced dementia, the songs that she would sing to herself were from Fiddler on the Roof. She grew up in an actual shtetl in Lithuania. But for her, what was authentic was sunrise, sunset. And that was true for her. And so authenticity almost is like, to name it is almost this kind of power claim. Like, I have my hands on this authentic, real thing. There, in that essay, I was concerned to not just do to not just say it's not this, but what is it? And for me, it has something to do with personal authenticity, not in a subjective, relativistic sense, but when has a choice you've made been really the product of good discernment? And how do I do that? How do I make a decision that's not just based on my subjective whim, but actually is based on what Jews used to call cheshbon nefesh, an accounting of the soul, like a real profound, really looking at holding this particular practice, institution, community, affiliation with that kind of seriousness. To me, the notion that authenticity is permanently attached to any form, whether it's a synagogue or anything else, just feels crazy. I think I can imagine my sort of an inner critic here complaining that this is way too California and relativistic and spiritual and all that stuff. But that's my actual truth. That's actually what's true. And for me, it's the opposite of flaky and narcissistic. It's about a serious process of, is this really true? And I want to just add, like, I'm not sure that all suburban synagogues and congregations are a sinking ship. I actually think some are thriving. There is something about, for a lot of folks, not everybody, but for a lot of folks, there's something about being in a kind of mandatory community, even though you've opted in. But once you're in, and you show up for each other. And if somebody loses a spouse and they're coming to synagogue on Saturday morning, I think when I was 25, I did really care about the fact that their spiritual life was, lame and not good, and like the services were bad. And I don't think that way at all anymore. I mean, I think if an old school, unreformed synagogue community is meeting that person's deep emotional needs, that feels really authentic to me. So I've changed my fundamentalism on aspects of the sinking ship, and I think it really varies. What I've seen, in my Jewish professional life, what's left of it now, I do a lot of scholar in residence weekends, and I've seen a wide variety. I've seen some amazing synagogue communities where there's adult learning that's happening and people are excited, where kids actually are showing up to the religious school and they're inspired and like they're into it, where the community is welcoming of all different kinds of people, doing outreach to be even more welcoming. And then I've been to places where it's not like that. Last thing, I think, I don't know how much more we'll talk about innovation. There was an essay in, I think it was Conservative Judaism magazine, but it may have been Reform Judaism magazine, called "Today Everybody's a Reconstructionist," or "Today All of Us are Reconstructionists." So for a lot of people, the Reconstructionist movement is seen as a non-success, right? Because it's small and it's not nearly as big as the other ones. But in another way of seeing it, it was a gigantic success because it's totally virally taken over both Reform and Conservative Judaism, such that we don't even notice when something is actually a Reconstructionist import. It's so woven into these two main denominations. So I think that's true for Jewish innovation as well. I mean, one of definitely just that I can go to practically any boring synagogue and there's going to be some melody. It used to be a Karl Bach melody, now maybe not a Karl Bach melody, that there'll be some wordless melody that people are singing on a Friday night, indicates a kind of percolation of neo-Hasidic spirituality in that case, well beyond the bounds of those who primarily identify with that term.
Yeah, I mean, I think this would take us off on a tangent that probably we don't want to spend all that much time on, but I have concerns about that, actually, in the sense that I think a lot about how other elements that are going on in this or that part of the Jewish innovation world get brought into the world of larger organizations. And the problem there is that it has a tendency to tame the innovations, that it kind of says, hey, we love you, and it's sort of smothering you with your love. The beauty of Yavne, I think, is that it was away from Jerusalem and stayed there. And I think that if the ship is sinking, it's actually not a blessing to be invited to come onto the ship. And that's where, to me, the ship is sinking is different from parts of the ship sinking. I mean, I totally agree with everything that you said about the wonderful places that there are and the wonderful religious schools that there are and the ways that many communities take incredible care of one another in times of difficulty. And the problem is that they're all bound, they're all lashed together on a large ship that's ultimately sinking. The question is how to unbind all of those wonderful organizations and wonderful things so that when the ship sinks, they're still around and then they can maybe rebound. And I'm thinking our next iteration of our name is Judaism Rebound, and there are multiple levels of that, but that somehow all of those can bind themselves back together in some fashion. So how can we describe what's going on? How can we describe an aspiration about what can go on in the future and not put anybody down? Say no, there are actually wonderful things in all of these places. The problem is that there are a lot of not wonderful things in all of these places too. And is there a way to free the wonderful from the not wonderful?
A lot of the legacy institutions, are still committed to a set of values that don't really animate younger people. And by younger, I mean under 50. And so they're missing out on the real yearnings and the real thirsts that are actually there, whether it's for a prophetic answer to our current, period of American white supremacy, or whether it's a compelling way to motivate people to fight climate catastrophe, or whether it's contemplative practice that changes our relationship to our own minds and our own hearts. There's no one value that everybody shares, I don't think, but there actually are. One thing I love about this episode should really just be about Sarah Hurwitz's book, but the notion that some of these gifts are here all along is actually a really compelling one.
That's her title, just to clarify, if folks didn't hear that episode. Her title is Here All Along.
They can just look on the New York Times bestseller list. It's right under Enlightenment by Trial and Error. Anyway, I feel like there are these gifts, and I see your point about the vibrant institutions being latched together with the not vibrant ones. I guess we'll see what happens.
You just mentioned climate change, and I want to spend a little bit of time on making a connection between some of the work that you've been doing as a journalist and before that, I think, as an activist, and your own spiritual journey and the spiritual journey that you imagine other Jews might go on, because I think sometimes those are seen as independent from one another, and often in a worse than independent, that a spiritual journey is seen as indulgent or self-indulgent, and maybe it is. I guess I want to ask you about that, because you have been one of the, I would say, loudest Jewish voices, not necessarily doing it in a Jewish context, sounding the alarm on climate change. And we're also living at this particular political moment, which we could argue about how new it is, or whether it's just putting things that have been there for a very long time in our faces. But for me, if Judaism doesn't fundamentally have something to say about these crises that are potentially threatening the future of life on Earth, and certainly threatening the future of a life on Earth that seems worth living to me, then I guess I wonder, what the heck is the point?
We're in heated agreement on that one. It's always funny when someone says, like, please don't bring politics into the synagogue. It's like, what else is there to bring into the synagogue? I don't mean partisan politics. Obviously, people have disagreements, and we should have spaces, Jewish communal spaces, that are large enough to hold those. But just like you said, and if Judaism can't talk to the extinction on life and earth, then it really has no value. It's funny, too. I'm a relatively new parent at the ripe old age of 48. I have an almost 2-year-old. And that cliche about, what kind of world are we leaving our children has really become very true, very real for me. I hold my 2-year-old daughter in my arms, and I just wonder about the world that she's going to live in 25 years from now, where the climate refugee problem is on the billion-person scale. Look at what's happened with the resurgence of nationalism when we have a few 100,000 refugees, who, incidentally, at least from Syria, are climate refugees. And so, it's terrifying, and I do share your mystification at anyone who thinks that Judaism shouldn't have something to say around this. Right now, I have 2 jobs. One is a spirituality job. The other is a social justice job. I'm a legal affairs columnist for the Daily Beast, and I'm a columnist, not a reporter. So I'm an opinion columnist. I do my best to say things that hopefully inspire progressives and anger conservatives. And then the rest of the time, I'm teaching meditation to a broad audience. There's zero doubt in my mind that the two reinforce each other. I think without some kind of political activism, whatever that looks like for some person, spiritual practice is very narcissistic if it's just about the self, if it's not about community and justice and the planet. At the same time, I was a professional LGBT activist for 10 years. That was my job. And my meditation practice provided me so many tools, whether it was dealing with haters and responding in a way that was effective rather than reactive, recharging my own batteries so that I could go out and do the work. And I was doing that work, during that big period of change, which I did not really bring about, but which I was around for, where marriage equality went from a crazy idea to federal government policy. And I couldn't have done the little work that I did do in that arena if it weren't for the resources that I gained from my spiritual practice. Finally, I think, my favorite verse from the Torah, which appears several times actually in the Torah, is don't oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And I love that command, not just for its command and its new relevance today, but also from the notion that we actually have to do some work to be empathetic. We have to remember that we were slaves in Egypt, or if we put that in a modern frame, to take an intersectional lens, to realize that just as we have been oppressed, so others are being oppressed. That is a spiritual practice. To really actually be willing to imagine what it's like to flee your home country because your children aren't safe from gang violence and travel 500 miles and then be torn away from your children at the border. To really inhabit that is the central commandment of the Torah.
I think what you're getting at in terms of the intersection between social justice and spiritual practice is really crucial. And just to bring it back to your book once again, I mean, there were so many pieces that I had lots to ask you about. I want to ask this time just a one-part question.
I don't believe it.
I know. One part. You wrote an essay that the title is, I think, Am I Religious? ? Are you religious? Would you consider yourself religious? Go.
Who's asking? That's the glib answer, but that actually is the answer. In that essay, "Am I Religious?" I quote the German Romantic philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher, who talks about being religious as being kind of in love with the world, or in a sort of proto-Heschelian way, in awe of and amazement at what there is in the world. And I think Heschel would add, motivated by that awe and amazement to do the work of holiness, which is the work of social justice. In that definition, I'm absolutely religious. In the definition of a majority of religious people in America, I'm probably not religious. If religious means adhering to a faith, a creed, a theology that involves God and something about either commandment in the Jewish frame or sin and grace and redemption in a Christian frame, if it means believing that there's reward and punishment for my actions from some heavenly force, even a Reconstructionist heavenly force, that I'm not. And I'm kind of fine with that. I realize there's sort of a having my cake and eating it too. Like, I want the good of religion without the bad. So I own the fact that my answer feels a little bit like a cop-out, but the way the German Romantics and then Abraham Joshua Heschel understand religion, I'm absolutely religious and I'm proud of it. The way that many religionists, both fundamentalist and other, understand it, I'm happy to lose the label and they can call me a heretic if they want. Maybe, incidentally, that's what being a heretic is, back to that point. We heretics have a conception of what religion is. It just differs from the majority conception or the dominant or hegemonic conception. So the person who eats a cheeseburger because they don't feel bound by any religious norm is not religious. Great, that's great, or in this hypothetical. But the person who eats a cheeseburger because they think it's the spiritually right thing to do to cut through the bounds of guilt and constriction that they grew up with, that person's religious in my sense. That's the heretical sense of religious. That's what I love about religion and why I find it so continually fascinating.
So I thought maybe we should close with a question about education to tie it back into the series, but also to try to put a bow on some of what we've been talking about. I don't know if there's a connection, but I want to read a paragraph from your book that I was particularly struck by. It's a point worth sharing, where you write, "At the Sunday school where I teach, a teacher was trying to teach something about a point of Jewish law, and the kids were misbehaving. They were full of energy, so he got a little upset at them. I suppose if you trace it back, the point of Jewish law eventually leads to God, but those kids with their energy were God. It was as if people argue about and puzzle over and declare the absence of exactly what they are at the exact moment that they're denying it." I think it's interesting. I guess my question about education is, number one, what does education look like when you understand in this sort of panentheistic way that you're talking about that the children themselves are God? And I think that I'm thinking back to our conversation with Sarah Hurwitz, where her book starts out with her very unsatisfying experience in Hebrew school, and then this incredible journey as an adult of discovery. And one of the things that she said to us was, one of the most eye-opening things to her was when she first learned about the principles of Judaism and that we're all created in the image of God. And she was just blown away by that idea. Whether you believe in God or not, or whatever God you believe in, the idea that we're created in God's image, and that's the animating idea of Judaism, was just kind of mind-blowing to her. And I was wondering, isn't that a flaw in our education, that sort of the things that would be most exciting to people, whether it's that we're all created in the image of God or that everything is God or whatever it might be, are the things that we don't teach children at all usually? And I guess my question is, is there a way to rethink education that flows out of everything that you've experienced? Or is the answer that really what we need to do is reposition Jewish education as something for adults, because it's really not possible to do the kind of education that does the job that we wanted to do for children?
One thing that hasn't changed in my 20 years of being in the Jewish world is this kind of disfavored, sort of in the closet position of spirituality in Jewish education. I get that it's not for everybody, obviously, and certainly the kinds of Jewish spirituality that are sort of maybe the most prominent are a way to kind of la 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 and woo woo and weird and whatever, and like young people don't take it seriously and it looks kind of silly or something. But if you look at the data about the spiritual but not religious, the largest growing religious denomination in America, so-called religious, is the spiritual but not religious. People who don't identify with any particular religious community, but who are still actually looking for fundamental answers to fundamental questions. If not, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of my life? How do I relate to others? If you're a little bit older, how do I get my kids to be mensches, to be good people? We have in the Jewish tradition resources for all of these, and we have these practices which are so beautiful. Again, I'll just give a personal example. It's not in the book because obviously I wasn't a parent when I wrote the book. Just something. We light Shabbat candles every Friday night with my daughter. We don't have she certainly doesn't have a theology about what's happening in that moment. We certainly aren't doing it out of any sense of covenant or commandment or obedience to Jewish law, to halakha, or because the Talmudic rabbis said so. We're doing this beautiful thing. She loves ritual moments. She knows it's a special moment in some sense. She knows the day of the week. She looks forward to it on a Friday. She goes over the candlesticks and there's just something so beautiful. I mean, that to me is a very simple spiritual moment that you don't need to go on a 3-month silent meditation retreat like I did in order to get it. And yet there again, there's sometimes this weird miseducation around what the value of lighting Shabbat candles is, that it is connected to all of those things. Well, Jewish law this and the bracha that and the thing, and it's like giving orthodox answers to a non-orthodox question sometimes, even in Reform and conservative contexts. So I have to admit, I thought things would be better by now. I really did think on climate change too, since you brought that up, which I've been writing about since 1998. I thought that by now there would be some recognition that for some percentage of younger Jews, something like contemplative practice, spiritual practice, meditation, Jewish spirituality, something in that general cloud of associations would be of value. As best as I can tell, it's still not really. My real ambition for this new book is that, maybe only 7 or 8 people are going to buy it, but 6 of those 7, I think, are going to love it. This is the life raft from the Titanic for me. And I know it's not going to be the raft for everyone, but for me, this actually is what made Jewish practice relevant and alive for me after a decade of kind of stagnation. With meditation, it was like discovering the answer key to Judaism, just these simple rituals that had been around me since I was born. I was raised in a conservative Jewish home. All of a sudden, these rituals were like alive with beauty and with meaning in a way that they hadn't been before. So if you, listener, are one of those 7 people who are going to buy this book, my hope is that it's the life raft for you and that it can provide one way of thinking about what your own raft might look like.
Thank you so much, Jay Michaelson, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Lex.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we also hope that you'll prove our guest Jay Michaelson wrong by going and purchasing that book in numbers that are more than 7. We think that a bunch of you would be interested in this, and we encourage you to purchase it. You can go to our show notes page on the website. It has info about how to buy the book, and you can also just type in Enlightenment by Trial and Error into your nearest device. Go to whatever website you like buying books at. So with that, we are going to close out the episode, and we're going to do so by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email, Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com, whichever. We also would love it if you are interested, willing, and able to support us with a financial donation, and you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. We really do appreciate you tuning into this episode. We hope that you'll continue along with us through the remainder of our unit on Jewish education. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.